On a cold February morning in 2020, in a quiet corner of Oregon where mist clings to the evergreens and neighbors still wave from their porches, a person vanished. The disappearance happened in broad daylight, in a place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked and children played in yards without supervision. The victim's name was Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, a library assistant who loved hiking and kept a garden that bloomed even in winter. She left behind a 6-year-old daughter, a husband of 8 years, and a community that would spend months searching every trail, every ravine, every hidden pocket of wilderness within 50 miles. But what made this case extraordinary was not the disappearance itself. It was what came after. It was the silence that settled over the investigation like snow, the cold case that gathered dust for nearly 3 years, and the revelation that would eventually tear through the community like lightning through still air. How does someone vanish completely in a town of 3,000 people? And what happens when the person you trust most is the one who knows exactly where they are? The town of Willow Creek sits tucked into the Cascade foothills, population 2,847 at the last census, a place where the main street runs 6 blocks before dissolving into farmland and forest. The mountains rise to the east, their peaks white with snow even in summer, and the Willow River cuts through the valley floor, cold and clear and full of steelhead in autumn. Most people who live here have lived here all their lives, or came looking for something quieter than the cities to the west, Portland and Eugene, with their traffic and noise. The economy runs on timber, though not like it used to, and on the small businesses that line Main Street. The hardware store and the diner, and the market where Sarah Mitchell worked part-time shelving books and helping elderly patrons find large-print mysteries. The Mitchell family lived on Pinewood Drive, a residential street where houses sit on half-acre lots with Douglas firs towering overhead. Their home was a modest ranch style built in the 1970s, white siding with green trim, a detached garage. A yard where their daughter Emma played on a swing, said her father had installed the previous summer. Daniel Mitchell, 36, worked as a technician for the county water department, a steady job with benefits, the kind of position that meant security in a place like Willow Creek. Neighbors described them as quiet, friendly, the kind of couple who kept their lawn mowed and their recycling bins organized. Sarah drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, silver, with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot mishap the year before. Daniel drove a Ford pickup, dark blue, with an extended cab and a toolbox mounted in the bed. February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day. The morning arrived gray and cold, temperature hovering just above freezing, the kind of damp that seeps through jackets and settles in bones. Sarah woke at 6:30, same as always. She made coffee in the kitchen, standing by the window that looked out over the backyard where frost covered the grass in white crystals. Emma was still sleeping. Daniel had already left for work, an early call to repair a water main break on the north side of town, or so he told the investigators later. Sarah's routine was predictable, something investigators would note repeatedly in the days that followed. Coffee first, then shower, then wake Emma for breakfast before driving her to elementary school by 8:15. After drop-off, Sarah had 2 hours before her shift at the library started at 10:30. But on this particular morning, something changed. At 7:45, Sarah sent a text message to her sister Jennifer, who lived in Bend, 90 miles away. The message read, "Need to talk soon. Important. Love you." Jennifer would later tell investigators she found this odd because Sarah typically called rather than texted, and the word important felt weighted. Urgent in a way that made her stomach tighten. She texted back, "Everything okay?" The message showed as delivered but was never read. At 8:05, A neighbor named Patricia Holloway saw Sarah's Honda still in the driveway as she drove past on her way to work. At 8:20, the elementary school secretary called Sarah's cell phone when Emma failed to arrive for class. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. By 9:30, when Sarah failed to show up for her library shift and failed to answer 3 more calls from her supervisor, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had worked with Sarah for 6 years. The first whispers of concern began. Margaret called Daniel at work. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm, perhaps slightly annoyed at the interruption. He said Sarah had been feeling unwell that morning, mentioned a headache, said she had probably decided to stay home with Emma and rest. He would check on them during his lunch break. Margaret thanked him and hung up, but something in the conversation bothered her, a detail she could not quite name. Later, she would tell investigators it was the certainty in his voice, the way he had an explanation ready before she finished asking the question. At 11:45, Daniel returned home. His supervisor at the water department, a man named Robert Keene, would later confirm that Daniel radioed in, said he needed to check on his family, would be back within the hour. When Daniel arrived at Pinewood Drive, the house was empty. Sarah's car sat in the driveway, driver's side door unlocked, keys in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet, credit cards, and identification inside. Emma's backpack hung on its hook by the front door, her snow boots lined up beneath it. The coffee pot sat on the counter, half full, cold. Sarah's phone was on the kitchen table, face down, battery at 63%. Daniel called 911 at 12:03. The recording of that call would be played countless times in the months and years that followed, dissected for tone and inflection, and the spaces between words. His voice sounded steady, controlled, perhaps too controlled for someone reporting a missing spouse and child. He told the dispatcher his wife and daughter were gone, their cars were there, Sarah's phone was there, everything was there except them. The dispatcher asked if there had been an argument, if Sarah had seemed upset or distressed. Daniel said no, everything had been normal, they had said goodbye that morning like always. The first deputy arrived at 12:18. Deputy Marcus Freeman, 42 years old, 20 years with the county sheriff's department. A man who had seen his share of domestic calls and missing person reports in a rural county, where people sometimes walked away from their lives without warning. He found Daniel standing in the driveway, hands in his pockets, watching the road. Freeman would later write in his report that Daniel's demeanor struck him as unusually calm, almost detached, but he also noted that people respond to stress in different ways. And he tried not to let first impressions color his assessment. By 1 o'clock, 4 more deputies had arrived. They conducted a systematic search of the house, the garage, the yard, looking for signs of struggle, forced entry, anything unusual. They found nothing disturbed. Beds were made, dishes were washed and stacked in the drainer. Emma's toys sat organized in plastic bins in her bedroom. Sarah's hiking boots stood by the back door. Her winter coat hung in the hall closet. Deputy Freeman asked Daniel to walk him through the morning one more time, starting from when he woke up. Daniel complied without hesitation. He had woken at 5:15, showered, dressed, eaten a bowl of cereal standing at the counter. Sarah was still asleep. He left the house at 5:45, drove to the water department yard to pick up the service truck, arrived at the work site by 6:20. He spent the morning repairing a broken valve, working in the cold with 2 other technicians who could verify his presence. He received Margaret's call at 9:30, made his radio call to his supervisor at 11:40, arrived home at 11:45. But there was a problem with this timeline, a small crack that would grow wider as investigators looked closer. Clear's Throat, the work site where Daniel claimed to have spent the morning, was 12 miles from his house. The drive took approximately 18 minutes. His supervisor confirmed Daniel had radioed at 11:40, saying he was leaving the site. Yet Daniel claimed he arrived home at 11:45, 5 minutes for an 18-minute drive. When Deputy Freeman pointed out this discrepancy, Daniel paused, just a beat too long, before saying he must have been mistaken about the exact time. Perhaps it was 11:50 or even noon. He had not been watching the clock closely. He had been worried about his family. The search expanded. By mid-afternoon, 12 deputies and 40 volunteers from the community were walking grid patterns through the neighborhood, calling Sarah's name, checking sheds and outbuildings and the wooded lots that bordered the residential streets. The elementary school went into soft lockdown, not a threat exactly, but a precaution. Jennifer, Sarah's sister, received a call from a deputy at 2:30. She immediately got in her car and began the drive from Bend, crying so hard she had to pull over twice to compose herself. Sarah's parents, retired and living in Arizona, booked flights that would arrive the following morning. Those who knew Sarah described her as devoted to her daughter, reliable to the point of rigidity, someone who planned meals a week in advance and never forgot birthdays. The idea that she would simply leave without telling anyone, without her phone or wallet or vehicle, without ensuring Emma was cared for, struck everyone as impossible. But the alternative was worse. The alternative suggested something had happened to her, to both of them, in the space between when Daniel left for work and when the school secretary made that first phone call. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. Search teams continued with flashlights and thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the state police. The local news arrived, cameras and reporters setting up across the street from the Mitchell house, broadcasting live updates every hour. Daniel stood in his driveway and gave a brief statement to the cameras at 7 o'clock, his face pale in the artificial light, his voice cracking just once when he said Emma's name. He said he loved them, he needed them to come home, he would not rest until they were found. He said if anyone had any information, any detail no matter how small, please call the sheriff's department. The video of this statement would be viewed 17,000 times in the first 24 hours. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves, comparing notes, sharing observations. Daniel had been cooperative, perhaps overly so, answering every question without asking for a lawyer, allowing them to search his house and vehicles without requiring a warrant. His phone records showed no unusual calls or texts. His bank account showed no large withdrawals. His coworkers confirmed his alibi for the morning. Yet something felt wrong, the way a door that looks closed might actually be unlatched, waiting for the right pressure to swing open. Deputy Freeman wrote in his notes, "Subject maintains eye contact. Answers questions directly, no visible signs of deception, but something off. Cannot articulate. Gut feeling. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that cold whisper of suspicion while wanting desperately to be wrong. You understand the terrible space investigators occupied that first night." The search continued for 6 days. Teams combed through 300 acres of forest, walking shoulder to shoulder through underbrush and across hillsides still patched with snow. Divers from the state police searched the Willow River where it ran deep and dark, beneath the Highway 20 bridge. Dogs trained in cadaver detection worked the woods, the riverbank, the agricultural fields south of town. Nothing. Sarah and Emma had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. On day 7, the sheriff held a press conference and announced they were treating this as a criminal investigation. He did not use the word abduction, but everyone understood the implication. Daniel submitted to a formal interview at the sheriff's department on day 9. He brought his attorney, a man from Eugene who specialized in family law, which struck some observers as an odd choice for a criminal matter. The interview lasted 4 hours. Daniel maintained his story without variation. He loved his wife. He loved his daughter. He had no idea where they were or what had happened to them. He passed a polygraph examination administered by a technician from Portland, though investigators noted that polygraphs measure stress responses, not truth. And some people can manipulate their physiological reactions. Still, it was one more piece of evidence that neither confirmed nor eliminated him as a suspect. Weeks passed, then months. The case went cold in the way cases do, when every lead has been followed to its end, and no new information emerges. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case file and concluded that statistically, when a spouse and child disappear and no bodies are found, the most likely scenario involves the other spouse. But statistics are not evidence, and without physical proof or witnesses or a confession, no prosecutor would bring charges. The community remained divided. Some believed Daniel was a grieving husband trapped in a nightmare. Others believed he had done something unspeakable and hidden it so well that no one could prove it. Sarah's parents hired a private investigator who spent 3 months retracing the original investigation and found nothing new. Jennifer moved to Willow Creek, renting a small apartment downtown, unable to leave while her sister remained missing, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a time, waking from dreams where Sarah called her name. The case file grew to over 1,500 pages. Interviews with neighbors, friends, co-workers, family members, phone records, financial records, surveillance footage from every camera within 5 miles of the Mitchell house on February 14th, grainy images of cars passing, people walking dogs, the ordinary flow of morning traffic. Investigators identified and tracked down every vehicle that appeared in that footage, interviewing drivers, eliminating possibilities one by one. They found nothing that led anywhere. The investigation slowed. Detectives moved on to other cases, though the file remained open, technically active, a wound that would not quite close. Clear's throat. 18 months after Sarah and Emma disappeared, Daniel Mitchell sold the house on Pinewood Drive and moved to an apartment complex on the east side of Willow Creek. A 2-bedroom unit on the ground floor with a view of the parking lot. He continued working for the county water department, showing up on time, doing his job competently, speaking to co-workers only when necessary. He stopped giving interviews to reporters. He took down the Facebook page that had been created to help find Sarah and Emma. The one with thousands of followers and hundreds of posts from people offering prayers and theories and amateur detective work. He told Jennifer, in one of their last conversations, that he needed to move forward with his life, that he could not spend every day in the past, that he had to believe Sarah and Emma were at peace wherever they were. Jennifer would later say this was the moment she knew with absolute certainty that her brother-in-law had done something terrible. Not because grief has a timeline or an appropriate way to manifest, but because of the specific words he chose, the past tense, the assumption of death. The phrase "at peace," which suggested knowledge rather than hope. But knowing something and proving it are entirely different challenges, and she had no more evidence than the investigators who had spent months searching for any fragment of truth. For those who have ever lived with suspicion, who have watched someone you once trusted and wondered what they might be capable of, you understand how corrosive that uncertainty becomes. Jennifer found herself driving past Daniel's apartment at odd hours, watching for lights, for movement, for anything that might reveal the truth. She knew this behavior bordered on obsession, knew it was consuming her life, knew it would not bring Sarah back, but she could not stop. She attended every city council meeting, every sheriff's department budget hearing, every public forum where she could stand up and demand that the case remain a priority. that resources continue to be allocated, that her sister not be forgotten. Some people admired her persistence. Others whispered that she needed to let go, to accept that some mysteries have no answers, that grief can twist into something unhealthy if not carefully managed. 2 years and 4 months after the disappearance, in June 2022, Daniel began dating again. The woman was a teacher at the high school in the next town over, divorced with 2 children of her own. Someone who had no connection to the original investigation and knew Daniel only as a man who had suffered a tragedy. They met at a hardware store, a chance encounter that turned into coffee and then dinner, and then something more serious. Jennifer learned about this relationship from a mutual acquaintance and felt physically ill, imagining this woman and her children in Daniel's apartment, unaware of what Jennifer believed he had done. She called Detective Freeman, now a sergeant, and told him about the new relationship, asked if there was any way to warn the woman to protect her children. Freeman said gently that Daniel had not been charged with any offense, that he was legally entitled to live his life, that unless new evidence emerged, there was nothing law enforcement could do. But for those who have noticed how truth sometimes surfaces in unexpected ways, how secrets kept too long begin to leak at the seams, the waiting was not entirely in vain. Children, especially young children, carry trauma in ways that manifest gradually. They do not always have the language or the context to understand what they have experienced. They file away images and sounds and moments that emerge later in play, in drawings, in sudden outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. In August 2022, the teacher Daniel was dating brought her 6-year-old son to a counseling session. The boy had been having nightmares, waking up screaming, refusing to sleep in his own bed. During one session, while playing with toy figures, the boy arranged them in a specific way and said something that made the counselor pause, her pen hovering over her notepad. The boy said, "The man put them in the ground where the trees grow big." The counselor asked careful questions, maintaining a neutral tone, not wanting to lead the child or suggest answers. The boy continued playing, moving the figures around. He said the man told him it was a secret, that secrets keep people safe. He said he saw this in a dream, but maybe it was not a dream. The counselor asked if the man in the dream had a name. The boy said it was the man his mother liked, the one with the truck. The counselor wrote this down word for word, underlined it twice, and after the session ended, called Child Protective Services. Within an hour, CPS contacted the sheriff's department. Within 2 hours, Detective Freeman was on the phone with the counselor, requesting permission to speak with the child and the mother. The mother, whose name was Rachel Hendricks, was horrified. She had known Daniel for 6 months, found him kind and attentive, a man who seemed to understand loss and loneliness. She had introduced him to her children carefully, slowly, making sure they were comfortable before allowing him to become part of their lives. Her son had been to Daniel's apartment 3 times, always with Rachel present, never alone, never unsupervised. Yet the boy had seen or heard, or experienced something that was now emerging in disturbing fragments. Rachel gave permission for the interview immediately, sitting beside her son, while a detective trained in child forensic interviewing asked questions in a soft, patient voice. The boy repeated what he had told the counselor. He said during one visit to Daniel's apartment, while Rachel and Daniel were in the kitchen making dinner, he had wandered into the bedroom and found a notebook on the nightstand. The boy could not read very well yet, but he remembered opening the notebook and seeing a drawing, crude but clear, stick figures with labels, and what looked like a map with an X marked in one spot. He said when Daniel came into the room and saw him with the notebook, Daniel's face changed, got very still, and he took the notebook away and told the boy this was private. That looking at other people's private things was wrong, But if the boy kept this secret and never told anyone, Daniel would take him fishing. The boy had kept the secret until the nightmare started, until his mind began processing what his eyes had seen in that notebook, connecting images to the story he had heard at school, the one about the missing mother and daughter. Because even 2 years later, children in Willow Creek still talked about it, still warned each other about strangers, still knew that Emma Mitchell had been in first grade when she vanished. Detective Freeman obtained a search warrant for Daniel Mitchell's apartment that same day. Judges do not issue warrants lightly, especially not based on the statements of a 6-year-old child describing something he saw months earlier. But the specificity of the details and the context of the unsolved case provided sufficient probable cause. At 6:15 in the morning on August 19, 2022, 4 deputies entered Daniel's apartment with weapons drawn, clearing rooms, securing the space. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast when they came through the door. He stood slowly, hands raised, asking what this was about, his voice calm but his face pale, drained of color. They searched for 4 hours. They photographed everything, documented every drawer and closet and box. They found no notebook matching the boy's description on the nightstand or anywhere else in the apartment. But they found something else. In the garage, in a plastic storage container labeled camping gear, beneath sleeping bags and a tent and a propane stove, they found a shovel with dried mud on the blade. They found work gloves with soil embedded in the fabric. They found a handheld GPS unit. When they powered on the GPS unit and accessed the saved waypoints, they found a location marked 8 months prior, coordinates that placed it in the Deschutes National Forest, 47 miles from Willow Creek, in a section of dense woodland accessible only by logging roads that required a 4-wheel drive vehicle. Clear's throat Daniel was arrested at 9:30 that morning and charged with 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. The arrest made national news within hours. Reporters descended on Willow Creek from Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, camera crews setting up in front of the sheriff's department, interviewing anyone who would speak on record. Public reaction split immediately and predictably. Some people expressed relief that the case was finally moving forward. Others insisted Daniel was innocent, that the evidence was circumstantial, that a GPS waypoint and a muddy shovel proved nothing in a community where people camped and hiked and gardened regularly. Jennifer broke down when she received the call from Detective Freeman. She had waited so long for this moment, imagined it 1,000 times, but the reality felt surreal, almost anticlimactic. She drove immediately to the sheriff's department and sat in the lobby for 3 hours, waiting for any information, any update, unable to do anything else but be there, be present, bear witness. On August 21st, 48 hours after the arrest, a team of forensic investigators and search and rescue personnel traveled to the coordinates saved in the GPS unit. The location was exactly where the waypoint indicated, a clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas firs, the ground covered in thick layers of pine needles and moss. They brought ground-penetrating radar equipment, cadaver dogs, and archaeologists trained in careful excavation. The dogs alerted within 20 minutes. The radar confirmed anomalies in the soil, disturbances consistent with human burial. They began digging, working slowly, documenting everything, preserving whatever evidence might remain. They found them 3 feet down, wrapped in plastic sheeting that had degraded over time, but not so much that identification would be impossible. Dental records would later confirm what investigators already knew from the size and positioning of the remains. Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma together, placed carefully, deliberately, in a grave that would have remained undiscovered if not for a 6-year-old boy who saw a notebook and carried that image into his dreams. The autopsy would reveal that both had been struck in the head with a blunt object, something heavy and solid, probably a hammer, though the weapon was never recovered. Time of death was consistent with the morning of February 14, 2020, somewhere between 6 and 9 o'clock. A window that aligned perfectly with the period when Daniel claimed to be at work, but had that unexplained gap in his timeline. Investigators theorized, based on the evidence and later testimony, that Daniel had not gone to work that morning. He had stayed home or returned home shortly after leaving, and had done what he did for reasons no one would ever fully understand, because Daniel never explained, never confessed, never offered anything beyond flat denials. The trial began in March 2023. The prosecution presented the GPS coordinates, the shovel, the testimony of the 6-year-old boy, the timeline discrepancies, the bodies buried exactly where Daniel's GPS said they would be. They presented character witnesses who testified that Daniel had seemed increasingly distant in the months before the disappearance, that Sarah had confided to friends she was considering separation, that there had been arguments about money and the future. They presented a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but had cracks invisible to everyone except those living inside it. The defense argued that the GPS unit could have been used by anyone, that Daniel frequently lent his truck to neighbors, that the boy's testimony was unreliable, the product of suggestion and false memory. They argued that the prosecution had no physical evidence linking Daniel to the actual act, no witnesses who saw him commit any violent act, no confession. Nothing but circumstantial connections that could be interpreted multiple ways. They presented Daniel as a victim himself, a man who lost his family and then was railroaded by investigators desperate to close an unsolved case. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On March 27th, they returned with guilty verdicts on both counts. Daniel showed no reaction when the verdict was read, staring straight ahead, his face a mask. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under Oregon law. As deputies led him from the courtroom, Jennifer stood in the gallery and said quietly, "I knew, I always knew." Daniel did not look at her. He looked at no one. The case file officially closed on April 3, 2023, 3 years, 1 month, and 20 days after Sarah and Emma disappeared. The community response was complicated, a mixture of relief and grief and anger that it had taken so long, that 2 people had to die before anyone understood what was happening, that a child had to carry a secret that gave him nightmares before the truth could surface. Some people apologized to Jennifer for doubting her. Others maintained their belief in Daniel's innocence, insisting the justice system had failed, that he had been convicted on weak evidence and the testimony of a child who might have been coached or confused. But for those who followed every development, who read every court document and watched every news report, the pattern was clear. Daniel had planned carefully, had waited for a day when his alibi seemed solid, had used his knowledge of the wilderness and his access to equipment to create a scenario where discovery would be unlikely. He had miscalculated in small ways, the timeline, the GPS unit, the notebook the boy described but that was never found, perhaps destroyed after that encounter. He had underestimated how truth persists, how secrets have weight, how children remember things adults think they miss. Sarah and Emma were buried together in Willow Creek Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley, under a shared headstone that reads simply their names and dates, nothing more. Because what else can you say that captures the complexity of a life cut short, a future stolen, a family destroyed by the person meant to protect it? Jennifer visits every Sunday, brings flowers, sits on the grass beside the stone, and talks to her sister the way she used to when Sarah was alive, telling her about the week, about the weather. about the small details that make up a life. She says she feels Sarah listening. She says she finally sleeps through the night. Daniel remains in Oregon State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life. He has declined all interview requests from journalists, true crime podcasters, and documentary filmmakers. He maintains his innocence, though he has stopped filing appeals. Those who work in the prison system say he keeps to himself, speaks little, causes no trouble. They say he seems like a man waiting for nothing, living in a present that extends endlessly without variation or hope or redemption. The teacher Daniel had been dating, Rachel Hendricks, moved to another state with her children, changing her name legally, trying to separate herself from the association with a case that will follow her forever. Her son, the one who saw the notebook, continues in therapy, working through the trauma of being the key witness in a double murder trial before he turned 7 years old. His counselor says he is resilient, that children can recover from almost anything with proper support, but she also says he will carry this always, a weight he did not choose and cannot set down. The Mitchell case became a teaching example in law enforcement academies, studied for what it reveals about cold cases, about the importance of following up on small details, about how investigations can stall when evidence is circumstantial and suspects are cooperative. It demonstrated how critical it is to never assume someone is telling the truth simply because they seem calm, how normal behavior is not the same as innocent behavior, how the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Detective Freeman retired 2 years after the trial ended. He told a reporter that in 30 years of police work, the Mitchell case was the one that stayed with him, the one he thought about when he could not sleep. Because he had known something was wrong from the first day but could not prove it, could not act on intuition alone. Had to watch the case go cold, while believing the answer was standing right in front of him. The house on Pinewood Drive where Sarah and Emma lived their last ordinary morning, sold to a family from California who knew nothing about its history until after the closing. They repainted the interior, tore out the old carpet, planted new shrubs in the front yard. They say it is a good house, solid bones, nice neighborhood. They say they feel no ghosts, no shadows, no residue of what happened there. But neighbors say sometimes late at night, lights go on in rooms that should be empty, and in winter, when the wind comes down from the mountains, you can hear sounds that might be crying or might be just the wind in the eaves, the ordinary noises that old houses make. For those who study these cases, who try to understand how someone can live with another person for years and never truly know them, the Mitchell case offers no easy answers. It suggests that the people we trust most are sometimes the ones capable of the greatest betrayal, that love and violence can exist in the same heart, that the line between protection and possession can be so thin as to be invisible until it is crossed. It reminds us that truth does not always surface quickly, that justice can take years, that sometimes the only witnesses are children who lack the words to describe what they have seen. Sarah Mitchell was 34 years old when she died. She left behind parents who will never recover, a sister who became an advocate for missing persons, friends who still speak her name with affection and grief. Emma Mitchell was 6 years old, first grade, learning to read chapter books, obsessed with horses and butterflies. A child who drew pictures of her family and hung them on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like strawberries. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Their story became extraordinary only because of how it ended, because of the man who decided one February morning that they would not be allowed to leave, that if he could not have them, no one would, that the ground would keep them better than any future they might have chosen for themselves. The case is closed, the graves are marked, the sentence is final, but closure is a word that means different things to different people. For Jennifer, closure meant knowing where her sister was, meant being able to visit her, meant seeing the man responsible behind bars. For the community, closure meant understanding what happened, meant confirming suspicions, meant restoring a sense of order to a narrative that had been incomplete. For Daniel, if he thinks about closure at all, it might mean something else entirely, some private accounting he conducts in his cell, some reckoning with choices that cannot be undone. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.